lesson 2.4, where we are talking about the lungs. So just to kick this off, the reason that I talk about this so specifically is that because it's actually one of the misconceptions that I first found when I started teaching meditation, specifically in schools, and not just with students, but also with staff members, predominantly with staff members, actually. So as you'll find out in module 3, we sit down and we start working with the breath as a bit of a warm up to the exercise, to the meditation. And what I would notice is that people were mostly adults and a lot of kids as well, when they were sort of guided to take these really specific breaths that were meant to send eustress messages to the brain. It looked a lot like this. So you might notice if you're watching the video that I'm breathing in through my mouth. So already that's more on the distressing side than a eustress side. And you'll also notice that the shoulders were coming up and down. This means that the person is breathing into the top of their lungs, into the shallow part of their lungs. It means that the rib cage is expanding to make room for the lungs. It means that the shoulders are being pushed outwards because the top of the lungs are expanding. And people predominantly think that when they take a deep breath to calm down, that's the way we do it. They don't take into account where the tongue should be, if the mouth should be open or closed, whether or not they should be breathing in through the nose. It's more just this almost automatic action of. Now, of course, this isn't everyone, and it might not be you, but it may be you. Whichever is the case, what we need to always come back to is, where is the breath traveling to? And this is something a lot of us don't think about. When we say to someone, mostly kids, take a deep breath, what will happen is they'll do just that. It'll be a message of distress to the brain. So they'll breathe like this for a little while. And they'll come out of it and they might be a bit head spinny, and they definitely won't be feeling any better. And they'll say, stop telling me to take deep breaths. It doesn't work. It doesn't change anything. It doesn't change all these stressful things that are happening to me. No, it doesn't, because all those distressing things are being consolidated through your distressing breathing pattern. And this is where the gold is. Again, if we can start sending eustress messages to the brain via our breathing pattern, then we are already getting ahead of the game. So let's quickly recap. As always, we're putting the tongue in its hammock position. We're then breathing in through the nose into the middle of the face, feeling that curvature down the throat. And now we're interested into where the breath or the air is actually traveling to. Now, again, like I said, most of us breathe into the top part of our lungs. Now, this is understandable because 70% of us are in a normalized state of distress, like we talked about in module 1. And if 70% of us are in a state of distress, 70% of us are going to be breathing with distressing breathing patterns. And part of that is breathing in shallowly to the top of the lungs. But we are in charge of the breathing. We are in charge of what pattern we are using. We just need to not push breathing into the category of it's an automatic function of the body. It's just there to, keep me alive and just do the bare minimum. I don't need to think about it. If we put it into the category of it's really important for my well-being to notice how I'm breathing on a moment-to-moment basis, and then to change the way I'm breathing if I need to in the moment, all of a sudden it becomes a superpower, and we're able to actually use it to create efficiency and to actually create what we want to see around us, and to create the emotional states and the behavior from ourselves that we want to see. So when we think of the lungs, let's think of it as just two balloons, really, really simple. And remember that the rib cage is essentially there to protect the lungs, because the lungs are quite fragile, just like balloons are quite fragile. So if we have a feel around, and again, if you're in the car, maybe just use one hand, but always keep focused on driving. So if you need to pull over, do that. Or if you need to do it when you get to your destination, do that. But our ribs are there to protect the lungs. So have a feel and find where those rib cages end, because this is a roundabout where the bottom of the lungs sit. And this is where I introduce another little bit of new language. What we're interested in is a base first breath. So that means we're interested in breaths that travel to the base of the lungs first. So they bypass the top of the lungs first, and they travel into the base of the lungs first. We come back to the top of the lungs a little bit later on, not in this essentials training, because it takes a little while to retrain ourselves to hit the bottom of the lungs first. Okay, so anytime now you hear me saying a base first breath, it's as simple as that. You know that you're sending the breath to around about that place where the rib cages end, not into your belly. We're not breathing into the belly. We're breathing into the bottom or the base of the lungs. Again, that's around about where the rib cages end. Now, when you do this, when you breathe into the base of the lungs first, you'll notice that the belly is coming out, but not because you're pushing it out. Throughout this whole process, you might have noticed what we're trying to do is deactivate as many muscles as possible, or not use as many muscles as possible. This was another big misconception I saw in my early days of teaching this, that a lot of people would actually, when asked to belly breathe, they would literally activate their belly muscles and force their stomach out. And then you'd see the breath sort of travel into the lungs. And they'd already pushed their belly out because they didn't understand that the belly comes out only because it's making room for the expanding base of the lungs. Just like when I'm breathing into the top of the lungs, my rib cage will come out, not because I'm moving it out, but because it's naturally being pushed out to make room for the lungs. It's got that flexibility, and the shoulders are doing the same. Now, whilst we're back at the top of the lungs, if we think about if I always breathe into the top of the lungs, that means the bottom of my lungs, the base of the lungs, aren't really getting used. And that, like anything in our bodies that doesn't get used, it starts to wither away after some time. And the base of our lungs can become weaker. Specifically here is this idea of the diaphragm, this thin sheet of muscle that sits underneath the lungs. This is literally a muscle that when it's strong, it can help our body and the quality of our breathing in amazing, brilliant ways. As always, there's further research attached underneath this video. But basically, what I want you to remember is that if we're not breathing into the base of the lungs, we're literally allowing this muscle to get weaker and weaker. Because when I breathe into the base of the lungs, it has to descend to make way for the base of the lungs, because the base of the lungs are expanding. So it has to descend. And then when I exhale, it comes back up into its release state. And that's a rep. So every time you breathe into the base of the lungs, you are literally repping one of the arguably most important muscles in the body, and one that, because we're a nation and a country and a culture of distress, we've allowed this muscle to wither away. We've allowed ourselves to forget about it. So again, belly breathing, diaphragmatic breathing, you may have heard all these terms. They're amazing. They're great. What we can sometimes overlook is just the fundamentals of what we're actually doing. Okay, and now you know 3 just really simple flags on the way of the journey of your breathing pattern. So now you know where the tongue needs to be. Now you know how it feels when you start breathing in through the nose, and now you know how and why it feels when you breathe into the base of the lungs. So let's have a quick little practice putting all those things together. Again, wherever you are, just make sure it's a safe place to practice this. Let's put our tongue in its resting state. Let's feel through the nose, not straight up towards the forehead, but back into the middle of the face. And you'll feel the difference. You can even experiment at the start. What does it feel like just to breathe in shallowly? And you'll feel like that is not enough air. You'll feel like you need to breathe for a little bit longer. And you'll feel a lot of movement down at the belly, down around the hips, down at the bottom of the lungs. And you'll feel very minimal movement up here. If you notice that the shoulders are going, if you notice that the rib cages are moving, that just means you're still breathing into the top of the lungs. And people get really upset about that. People get really distressed when they learn that they can't easily breathe into the base of the lungs. But again, it's like we've been saying in the previous lessons. it is a great thing because it means you've conditioned yourself into sending distressed messages. We can send these messages in all sorts of ways. Not breathing into the base of the lungs and only breathing into the top of the lungs is one of the ways we do that. And it's not your fault. It's not any of our fault. If we are conditioned to states of distress, that is the natural breathing pattern that I'm going to develop and get really good at over time, unconsciously, without me even knowing it. So now all you're discovering is, wow, I'm really conditioned into this way of breathing. Okay, it's not going to feel overly comfortable, but that's just because you're not practiced at it. Just like it doesn't feel comfortable going to the gym the first time, or going for that first walk, or going for that first jog or run. It doesn't feel comfortable, but it gets easier the more you practice. And the beauty of the breath is that it's with you all the time. You can practice this any time of day, especially when you're driving. It's a great time to practice it. So let's not get discouraged if it doesn't feel natural. If you find yourself overthinking it, remember you don't need to overthink it. Okay? Overthinking is just more activation, right? And we're talking about trying to decrease as much activation as possible. You're just looking for that flow. It's almost like if you imagine that the breath is water, it's almost just like you're allowing that water to flow through the nose and then just naturally tumble down into the base of the lungs, just like you would fill up a sink. The water's not going to float at the top of the sink. The breath will stop in the top of the lungs if we allow it. But if we allow it to behave like water, it'll just flow to the bottom of the lungs, just like it flows to the bottom of the sink. It's almost like getting out of its way. We want to get out of the way of the breath as much as possible. And if we're overthinking it, we tend to be getting in its way. It's almost like getting your hand in that flow of water from the tap as you're trying to fill up the sink. You know, if you get in there, you're going to flick water all around the place. You're going to make a bit of a mess and you're going to be less efficient at filling that sink up. It's the same thing here. Don't get in the way of it. Don't overthink the process. Now you have just 3 really simple skills that are going to allow the body to open up and allow that breath to tumble into the base of the lungs first. You're not pushing anything, especially those belly muscles, especially the hips, especially not the ribs and the shoulders. We want minimal movement. In fact, 0 movement if we can in those parts of the bodies and that upper torso. We want just natural flow into the base of the lungs. And you'll start to notice that it feels great. Okay, maybe not now, maybe not tomorrow, but if you keep practicing this, you will start to notice that sensation next week, because that is what consistency brings us with these skills. It brings us greatness. It brings us joy. It brings us a feeling of being back in control, which then results in efficiency. It results in more responses and less reactions, because we're shifting ourselves out of a state of distress and into states of eustress more often, instead of residing in states of distress. So hopefully you are starting to notice how comfortable you're feeling with this language. Hopefully you're starting to really feel that, yeah, this does make sense in my day-to-day. This does really resonate in different parts of my lives. Maybe not all of it, but some parts of it. And that is what's key, because that is where the change is really going to happen for you. So well done, as always. Thank you for being here this far already. We are about to move into lesson 2.5, where we are going to talk about the specific message and what that means when we're talking about the breathing pattern. So keep practicing this process. And then in lesson 2.6, we're actually going to talk about a pattern that we can practice to get best bang for buck in terms of sending that eustress message. So keep practicing. Tongue, nose, and base of the lungs, and you'll notice that it starts to get easier and easier and easier. And the more you do it, the better off you'll be. And there's no time where it's not a good time to practice. All the time, if you can. Even if you can't, even if you know you're running or you're exercising, it's extremely difficult to breathe in this way, especially at the start. It's possible, but it's extremely difficult. But even if you're just aware of it, even if you just experiment with the tongue whilst you're exercising, even if you just experiment with noticing what the breath is doing at any part of the day, whatever it is, just stay engaged with this learning as much as you can. As always, don't force it. Don't put any pressure on yourself. And at the end of this course, we're going to talk about lots of different ways that you can stay engaged with it in a really effortless way as well. But now you've learned 3 really important skills that we're going to keep referring back to all the time. So even though the language module is over, we're still refining our language as we go. We're still adding to that essential language that we learned about in module 1. Okay, I will see you in the next lesson where we get to talk about messaging again. Have fun, keep breathing.